to welcome you here for a speaker who already has been here very successfully last time on anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism, where we are going to publish a very, very major essay on this subject on the website of the Jerusalem Center very soon. It's a question of, I think, a week or so. Well, since this is the topic of today, concerns an issue which, in the broader framework of things we do about Israel and Europe, it is obvious that the old taboos are falling in Europe. Not only the taboo of being anti-Semitic, of relationships with Jews. 3-4 days ago, suddenly there was a poll in France. It showed that 1/3 of the French do not have any objection to declare that they consider themselves racists after the riots, and they consider also that racism in France, that racism under certain circumstances is perfectly justified. They also consider that with two situations, if an ethnic French or non-French are ethnic French or non-ethnic French are candidates for a job, that one should give priority to an ethnic French. Le Pen's more broader ideas on immigration today have a support if you don't mention his name among, specifically with the question of well over half of the population. Today, this shouldn't really surprise us. In a study which hasn't been much published in a German big poll done by the University of Bielefeld shows that more than 60% of the Germans think that there is essentially no difference between what Israelis do to Palestinians and what Nazis have done to the Jews. So we see a very, very rapidly moving scene in Europe. And I think in this context, it's particularly welcome to have an outstanding expert on Germany who follows the German scene on a day-to-day basis to speak about the falling of this taboo in Germany. A few announcements before the we have a lot of program. Next lecture on the 9th of January, Monday, 9th of January at 10 o'clock. Stephen Bain is one of the former, Changing Jewish Communities, one of the foremost scholars on American Jewry, the American Jewish Committee, and he speaks on the problems for Jewish leadership of the increased anti-marriage of Jews over the past decades. Then we have the 16th of January. It's difficult to memorize all this. We have the second symposium on Israeli European relations. Then we have on the 24th the next anti-Semitism lecture by Ed Beck, the chairman of Professor Ed Beck, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, in the United States, on all these issues of campuses, what the problem for professors on campuses, this post-colonial discourse on campuses. And then on the 1st of February, we have the Dan Elazar Memorial Lecture by Professor Shlomo Avineri on the political situation here. Well, we have a few more things, but I think that's about where my horizon ends. Now it's my great pleasure to ask Professor Markovits to speak. We have already introduced him once. His work has also been published by the JCPA. Professor Markovits was born in Timisoara in Romania in 1948. He emigrated to the United States in 1960. Most of his teenage years he has spent in Vienna. He returned to New York in 1967, to attend Columbia, where he got his 5 degrees. He is the Karl Deutsch Collegiate Professor of Comparative Politics and German Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He's written on several books on Germany. He has also another interest, which is the role of sport in society. He has written a book called Offside, Soccer and American Exceptionalism, which I can really recommend because it gives slightly different insights of those you will hear today. And his last book, which in the meantime is only in German, which will be reviewed in the JPSR, is Amerika, dich, hast, sich, besser, which essentially translates is America, it's easier to hate you. And the English version will come out in 2006 by Princeton University Press. Title of the lecture is A New, or perhaps revived, Uninhibitedness by Jews in Germany.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Manfred, very much. It was great to be here in last time in May, where I talked about the book that Manfred just kindly mentioned, and which will come out in Princeton with Princeton University Press under the, I think, very poignant title called The Uncouth Nation. Because the whole argument is, it's very historical also, that the European view of the United States is that of an uncouth nation. And, you know, too rich, not rich enough, eats funny, basically doesn't have status, parvenu, etc., etc. And it also has a chapter on anti-Semitism, which is the only part, actually, that is not really that much original research, but one cannot look at anti-Americanism without looking at anti-Semitism. I'm here at the moment, actually, in Jerusalem, teaching in an intensive course in the Institute for European Studies for MA students who get a master's in European Studies, and I'm teaching a course about all things Austria, intensive everyday lecture on Austria, and I find it very interesting, as I told Manfred already. I'm also delighted that Richard Landis is here. I always liked his work very much, and have taken a wonderful course from his father as a postdoc at Harvard. Great course. And of course, he was a longtime colleague of mine at Boston University, where I was for 9 years, before going to the West Coast and then now at Michigan. Okay, today's topic is basically arguing that there has been sort of in the post-Holocaust era until certainly 1990 or 91, a very clear compact or a very clear understanding, very clear form of collective culture, which basically made anti-Semitism in virtually all its forms simply not acceptable. In other words, it was not, you could not utter it, you could not speak it, you could not have it in even vaguely accepted society. This was, of course, for obvious reasons, even more or de rigueur in Germany than elsewhere. And what this paper argues is that this uninhibitedness, or this threshold, has been lowered massively, and that in fact, I argue, maybe not so much today, because we will concentrate on the German situation on it just itself and give lots of examples, but I see this lowering of the threshold very, very much linked to precisely America and anti-Americanism and Israel. Meaning that the lowering has two major dimensions or two major reasons. One of them, of course, is the passage of time. And then the other one is that I think as a testimony to progress in advanced industrial democracies, and I'm a great advocate of this, we have come to a dimension where indeed, or where you cannot speak ill of the weak. In fact, my next project, there are two kinds of academics, the hedgehogs and the butterflies, and I'm very much of a butterfly. I kind of go from project to project. And my next big project, I've just started getting some funding for this, is looking at animals, or the whole debate about animals and animal rights and the whole notion how Western societies over the last 20 years have completely changed the discourse and the behavior. So for instance, when Rome of all cities, passes a law in which you are obliged to walk your dog twice a day. Now, how will you enforce this is a different story, that you can't have round aquaria, et cetera, et cetera. The point being that all of this is a kind of discourse about the weak, which I think is a great testimony to, I would say, in advance in industrial democracies, that you have a respect for this. Well, Jews don't fall into this category anymore. And this is what really puzzles me. And Jews, especially by dint of Israel, are not the weak. Hence, you can't be anti-Semitic, or you can say things that you would never, apropos American campuses, would never say about the weak. And it's in this context that really the paper is about Germany, but it really is really about Europe. The examples will be about Germany, but it really is, I think, a much greater issue. It's a much more pan-European, and I think, as Manfred suggested in this lecture that you'll be hearing, and I know that from his work and through the Institute or the Center, there are pockets of this also in the United States, not by chance, precisely in the elite universities in which you do have a very strong discourse of, again, protecting the weak, which again, on the whole, I find completely not only acceptable, but commendable. What I don't find acceptable is that Jews are not seen as such, and in fact have become the ultra-strong. Now, life in many ways is very good for the Jews in Germany. They enjoy, for the most part, material security, notwithstanding little-known facts, for example, that in Frankfurt, nearly 1/3 of the Jews from Russia are on social welfare. Jews are well educated, their institutions are fostered and protected by the authorities. There are more synagogues probably than Jews, and it's not the joke, but it's really, there are lots of empty synagogues that are built, rebuilt. There exists a sort of Jewish chic even, I would say, among non-Jewish Germans that manifests itself in the massive proliferation, for instance, of klezmer bands, which are featuring non-Jewish Germans as producers and consumers to a degree that absolutely does not exist anywhere else in the world, including the United States and Israel. I don't think there's anywhere near as many klezmer bands or klezmer audiences in Israel as there are in Germany. You can, Berlin, nightly, you look at the what's going on pages, whatever, there are klezmer concerts. Moreover, of course, the German Jewish community, as you well know, is the only one in Europe whose membership continues to rise steadily. Nonetheless, I think the picture is not unclouded. And what I will focus on is certain examples. I will not focus on the increase in anti-Semitic acts, in other words, of violence or of desecrations and things like that, okay, which have also increased. Two developments, I think, are complementary but have very different origins pertaining to the Jews in Germany. The first, of course, mainly involves time. World War II is gradually receding as a factor affecting German life, thus making the Nazi era and its central events, of course the Holocaust, less relevant and compelling. In fact, I would argue that almost with an increasing sort of memorialization, November 9th has become a knee-jerk holiday, or not holiday, kind of memorial event. With that, there's also becoming a desensitization because of time. But the second, I think, development is qualitatively new and best be characterized as a new uninhibitedness or mental statute of limitation. 60 years after the end of World War II, the grace period, by the way, expressed with this very, to me, very ugly German term, Schonzeit, which means time of protection, but of course it comes from the language of hunting. It's the time that is allowed to protect the game. That was granted the Jews. This Schonzeit is actually a thing of the past. In German, indeed, or European daily life, if not yet in politics, there's an accepted public discourse. One encounters the sentiment that let's put an end to remembering the Holocaust. It has given the Jews a privileged ride, sort of from the language of rational choice, a privileged ride, kind of an added bonus that they no longer actually deserve or need. Clearly, they're no longer victims. They're not what I said, the weak. In fact, far from it. They are the strong. They are, in fact, the oppressors of another weak group, in this case, the Palestinians. To be sure, merely expressing the wish of having the Holocaust muted, or in fact, having pro-Palestinian positions, as the aforementioned Bielefeld study shows, need not be anti-Semitic. In fact, I would say it is not anti-Semitic. What is anti-Semitic is, in fact, if it coincides with tropes that are clearly classically anti-Semitic. And just to add to Manfred's, this is sort of seminar style, Manfred's point about the study, what the study shows is that you can, in fact, conceptually, you can be vehemently anti-Israel and not be anti-Semitic. However, empirically, this is virtually not present. If I remember correctly, I don't have it in front of me. 90%, exactly. Meaning, there are two axes, okay? Here is the axis of, I get angry, 6 or 7 points. I get angry when Israelis destroy Palestinian homes. I think the Israelis should give the Palestinians more rights. That are on and on and on, even stronger ones, and these are not ipso facto anti-Semitic. And then there are other classic anti-Semitic things, like, I won't shake hands with a Jew, Jews are shifty, And what you have is that, in fact, it's a very high correlation between the two. Okay, that 90% of the cases, at least one or two of both items are expressed of the 9 that are shown. Okay. I think what is also interesting in this, and also in Germany, is that this has become, and this is clearly through Israel, completely through Israel, the discourse over Israel, that anti-Semitism has entered the discourse of the left. In fact, my obsession is actually I don't care about right-wing anti-Semitism. That to me is harmless, unimportant. No, who cares, really? I'm being kind of provocative here. But that's not what I see as problematic. That is not what I see as problematic at American or whatever university. It's the issue about the left that really concerns me. It's not the trivialization really of the Nazi period, but using old anti-Semitic tropes to discredit Israel, which has entered into the discourse via the left, and thereby attained a legitimacy precisely because the left has always enjoyed the bonus of not being anti-Semitic and in fact being anti-Semitic. Now, as late as the mid-1980s, the controversy about this new uninhibitedness, Unbefangenheit, occurred largely actually a little bit of history here, between the conservative camp and the left liberal camp, basically sort of pitting the CDU versus the Red Greens. Okay? For example, the then Chancellor Helmut Kohl, in a visit to Israel, stated to the Knesset on the 24th of January, 84, and I quote, "I speak to you as someone who could not get caught up in guilt during the Nazi period because he had the grace of late birth, die Gnade des späten Geburts." Although some Knesset members reacted by leaving the chamber in outrage, Kohl's formulation was actually first used by the social democratic journalist and political advisor Günter Gauss. Very few people know this. A kind of a nationalist SPD, left nationalist person, actually used this Die Gnade des späten Geburt, which then becomes a code word. For a time, this formulation signified the division between the left and the right. The left side stood for confronting the past, assuming the responsibility and liability, and a decisive rejection of anti-Semitic prejudice. Though for most of the left, of course, at this stage too, issues involving Jews and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust were marginal at best. I'll conclude with an interesting research which goes even further than this. The conservative side tended to stand for relativization, exculpation, and rejection of permanent historical responsibility. But even at the time, however, such clear-cut classifications were misleading. Until the late 1970s, the relativizing and exculpating discourse was regarded as normal and was not seen as reprehensible by the mainstream of West German society. It's actually, we forget that it was really only in the course of this mid to late 70s until 1991 that you really had this very brief period of really coming to terms with the past. Only the broadcast of the American television series Holocaust, by the way, I think a terrible movie, but that's not the point, in January of 1979 inspired a certain turnaround. Crucial. It's a very, very important event. Actually, I did a research comparing Germany and Austria on the reception of this. I can discuss it with you if you want. For a time there had been anti-Semitic gaffes, public rejections of responsibility and reliability, and other forms of mitigating German guilt, without this receiving special notice or criticism. Since the end of the war, those advocating a radical confrontation with the past were clearly in the minority. For example, even Chancellor Konrad Adenauer was only able to provide West Germany's first financial assistance to Israel by relying on votes from the Social Democrats, then the opposition in the Bundestag. This aid was always called Wiedergutmachung by the Germans, best translated as restitution or reparation, which I think is misleading and even exculpatory in the terms because it was unclear what it was supposed to restore or repair. Since the late 1970s, however, the public became more sensitive, and what had been regarded as ordinary was now subjected to increasingly strong criticism, both in the political and cultural spheres. In contrast to the 1950s and 1960s, when voices criticizing West Germany's lax manner of dealing with National Socialism came primarily from the United States, Britain, and Israel, and a few other countries, now such voices were heard primarily in the Federal Republic itself. Taboo breaking has been on the rise since, and so this created this powerful cultural image. Now I'd like to look at the taboo breaking that ensued in the 1980s. And the above statement by Kohl is just one of many transgressions by members of Germany's intellectual, cultural, or political elite. One of the steadfast chroniclers of the trend has been the Berlin-based Jewish journalist Henrik Broder, who writes for the weekly news magazine Der Spiegel, in addition to commentaries on his website and numerous books and articles. His book, Der ewige Antisemit, which for some reason is still not out in English, at last I checked, which appeared in the context of the Historikerstreit, the famous historians' debate of 1986, is the first account of the scandals associated with this new uninhibitedness. Although I argue it's actually not in and of itself new. he basically looks at, chronicles this taboo breaking, and he basically talks about the importance of what he calls secondary anti-Semitism.